We'll now open the floor to questions. When you ask a question, please try and keep it brief and also say your name and college so you've received one of our invitations and come back to our room after this for some fine free wine. Well, I mean, it's not fine, but it's free anyway. So, anyway, do we have any questions? Yes, at the back, yeah.
Sorry, Sarah, this will be after floor speech, but I wanted to ask the opposition to the motion. How can you seriously expect the English working man to support the notion of globalism as a positive benefit for this country and in general for the world, when over the past 50, 60 years of increasing globalism, all that England has wrought from it is a decline in its national industries and therefore an increase in unemployment for the working man? And to compensate for that unemployment, the best that the globalists could offer was an ever-increasingly more liberal immigration system to bring in poor, impoverished working people from Eastern Europe to fill the roles that should have been taken up by English working factory men that collapsed after the decline of English industry under the extremely globalist Thatcher bubble. Surely all globalism has brought for the average man in this country is poverty and impoverishment, especially in cities like Durham, where before, maybe 50 years ago, Durham could have been called the city for the working man and is now just regarded as a place for bourgeois intellectual students like ourselves to congregate. How can you possibly say that globalism has done this place a favour when it's just made people unemployed, and the only solution that globalists have been able to offer for it is cheap imported labour, which benefits very much the middle and upper classes, but does very little to improve the general life of the working class in this country?
Thank you very much. We'll take one more question before hearing responses. Yes.
Peter from B College. To the opposition, I appreciate the characterization of capitalist globalization that you've given so far, but there are plenty of intellectuals in international relations theory who believe that globalization and the capitalist mode of production are two completely different institutions. It seems to me that things like medical procedures, things like cultural transmission, these things are results of the tools of globalization, but not of the capitalist mode of production. So would you be willing to accept that we should keep the tendencies of globalization, but at the same time change the way that we organize production under it?
Do you want to hear responses from the opposition first?
Well, as the oldest person on this side, I think, definitely the oldest person on this side, I could speak with some first-hand experience, I think, in response to the first question. So my parents lived throughout the 40s, 50s and 60s. I lived throughout the late 60s, 70s and 80s. And the idea that somehow the working people of this country are poorer today than they were, for example, towards the end of the 1940s when coal was rationed, there was an awful winter and families were sitting huddled around a fire with pipes bursting all over the place. That was a reality for my father. Probably, well, yes, with an outside toilet and so on. It's just an extraordinary caricature. But that's just Britain. It's maybe slightly harder to answer the question for Britain than it is for the world as a whole. But this notion is about 100% of the world, not just 7% of it. And there is no question that the life chances, every indicator of development for the world as a whole has improved during that era of globalisation. Whether that's caused by globalisation or not, well, we are debating that, but your question is about whether or not they're getting better off, and without question they are. Now, is that capitalism or globalisation or some other rarefied distinction that a professor of international relations operating in the global intellectual and academic debate may wish to make? Well, I think that's another debate. If it's globalisation but not capitalism, we're not debating capitalism here. I'd be quite happy to come back and debate capitalism. We're debating globalisation. And without question, we've had globalisation, and without question, I believe that it's done more good than harm.
Thank you. Do you have any responses from the Commission to those questions?
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, I think that a very good point is raised about the nature of deindustrialisation and bringing in cheaper labour from abroad. A lot of this was highlighted in the Brexit negotiations, where I was quite frustrated by the notion that we needed to make sure that companies could bring in people from other countries to work for lower wages than they do here. To take one example, there was a special dispensation for Romanian and Bulgarian workers to come to this country and work in the agricultural sector when otherwise they were barred from working in other sectors during a transitional period as part of their membership of the EU. That came to a close 2 years ago. Now, I don't actually know how long I've got, I'm not very long, is it? Now that came to a close. Now that meant that Romanians and Bulgarians could come here anyway. So presumably there would be no drying up of workers. But the agricultural bosses in this country were demanding that they extend it further east to Ukraine, to Russia, to get other workers in, because they knew that nobody would work in these farms in those conditions and those wages if there were any other jobs available to them. This is a race to the bottom that is caused by globalisation, and it would be, I would say, an example of the way that globalisation is driving standards down across the board.
Do we have any further questions? Yes.
I wanted to ask, it's not directed to either side, but with regards to globalisation and security, especially with you have terrorist groups across the globe being able to get their hands upon weapons illegally. You know, Saudi Arabian sort of weapons, old Soviet nukes can fall into the hands of sort of terrorist groups in Syria, for example, also could go to the North Korean state. Just with regards to how do you think that globalisation might have impacted the security issue both for the nation state and internationally with regards to terrorism?
We'll take a couple more questions before responses again. Oh, yeah. You want to go? You have to put any brief response to that immediately?
Yeah, I would go on that. I would say that it poses increased challenges. Obviously, since 9/11, you've had the increased challenge of international terrorism. But you've also had, and what you've seen, is the increased sharing and cooperation between countries that has never been seen before. We have British intelligence operatives saving individuals on the streets of foreign countries by sharing intelligence. The same goes for multiple countries with Five Eyes, multiple other intelligence services. Terrorism has obviously always existed. Obviously not quite to the same level or extent, but what we're actually seeing is you're seeing increasingly globalisation can't be undone. That's the issue. In a global world, we cannot undo the links that we've created. What we are seeing, though, is that people are becoming safer. We're sharing intelligence strategy, tactics, information, and that's making the entire world smarter.
Well, I can't explain how all weapons around the world end up in the wrong hands, but I can certainly explain how some of them do. So, globalized countries tend to love other countries that are part of the same system that will accept free trade, that will do business with them. And it's one of the overlooked small things like, you know, whether they're crazy Islamists or not. So, if you're wondering how, say, a whole load of Humvees ended up in the hands of ISIS, I mean, that's a good example. We've actually heard that Syria was one of these isolationist countries. It certainly was. It wasn't an Islamist country, though. Bashar al-Assad was a dictator, but not an Islamist dictator. And you actually saw a lot of funding from Western governments to Islamist groups inside that territory, and that included all sorts of weapons and support. So often globalism harms global security a lot more than it helps.
Thank you very much. If you have any further questions, I'll give a couple more responses to those. Yes.
We're at Greg College. For the globalization side, how the idea of globalization is nice, but how do you take account of, for instance, the ineffective nature of global organizations such as the UN? There's most of the things get vetoed, even with response. It seems like regional orders are much more effective at actually addressing practical matters than this global order because of the being so different between countries on this much larger scale. So even in Kosovo, we saw it was NATO, Regional Defensive Pact, not the UN, who effectively intervened to stop that ethnic cleansing. So how does the globalization side account for this ineffective nature of many global international orders?
We'll take one more question for responses. Another question? Yes. Yeah.
Just to the proposition side, Josephine Butler. I was just wondering, the motion I think is this House believes globalisation has done more harm than good. So I'm just wondering whether you accept the good that globalisation has brought. Which good would you accept, if any at all, or are you just arguing that globalisation has done harm?
Do we have any responses to those two questions from either side?
Well, I think my answer to the second question, my answer to the second question is obvious. On the issue of the first question, you raise a very important point. But the fact that we believe in globalisation, the fact that we believe in international institutions, doesn't mean to say that we believe that international institutions at the very most global level should be responsible for absolutely everything. Just as that we believe in government, none of us are anarchists here, but it doesn't mean to say that we believe that government should plan every aspect of our lives. International institutions have a role. It's always going to be difficult, of course, to get agreement in those international institutions, in particular, that rely on consensus. But we should expect international institutions to do those things which other institutions can't do. And the fact that other institutions at a sub-international level, or sub-world level, if you like, are extremely effective is merely an indication that in any society you need institutions at many levels doing their different jobs in appropriate ways.
So, do I accept that globalization has done some good? Well, it's made products cheaper. So, this would be a lot more expensive if we paid English workers a fair wage to produce it, as opposed to sweatshop workers in China. iPhones were brought up earlier in the debate. It might, I'm not sure if I think it was Mr. Stewart brought it up. I'm not sure if you read stories, but the workers at the Foxconn plant in China that produces these, they've had to install nets underneath the building because so many workers in that plant that makes these iPhones are throwing themselves off the top of the building. So yes, globalization has made this and other products cheaper, but is it worth it?
Thanks very much for those responses. Do we have any few more questions? Yes, yeah.
James, Castle College. I feel this debate has focused a lot around the material benefits or downsides of globalism. I'd like to hear responses about maybe ideological ones. So of course we live in a very globalised society. Things like Broadway long-range radio exist. This has completely decimated the diversity of opinions people seem to have because media has been basically flattened and there's very little range of consumption. For example, if you look at China, which you brought up, does it look more like a Chinese city or Boston? Most cities now look like cities, they don't have a character. And on that note, I'd like to talk about how this fuels potential ideological problems because you can have very bad ideologies spread very quickly, which I'd like to say maybe potentially communism. It's interesting, you talk about how war has gone down, and they always start war at 1950, right after the two biggest conflicts in global history. Now, I'd like to point out that, well, I'm not saying World War I was a globalist conflict or World War II was a globalist conflict. They had a globalist fringe, because all sides involved were about taking control and establishing a world order. And that is the kind of basis that globalism has built as its foundation, is this idea of control, and therefore it's potentially a very bad and harmful system.
Thank you. At this point, we have another question before responses. Oh yeah, yes, yeah.
So yeah, you mentioned
In the college, please.
when you're at some popular society, you mentioned sweatshops and how it is bad that people work there, but if you mentioned Bangladesh as well. But if you look at Bangladesh, the fact that they specialize in textile industries, and they're mostly females who work there, and before they didn't have any job, now they're able to, maybe it's not the highest paying job, but now they are earning money, they're able to spend it how they want it to be spent, and they're able to care for their family because Bangladesh is specializing in textiles, for example. So how can you argue against it? The fact that, yeah, of course, maybe they're not, maybe the working conditions are not the best, and maybe some factories are not treating their workers like in the best possible way, but still, some job is better than no job.
Yeah, do you want to do a response to that?
I think that when we're talking about people in some of those conditions, to say it's maybe not the best wage is a little bit a little bit of a rose-tinted spectacles on it. But I think that we underestimate the element of coercion in all of these processes. And Marx wrote very eloquently about the role of coercion in the 19th century in forcing the enclosure of the land that forced people off the land and into the cities because they needed peasants to get into the cities to work in the new factories that were springing up. This was not a voluntary process for many of these people. And when we talk about migration around the world as well, of course it's lovely for us in a rich country to say that we can go and work in another country and we can go on holiday in other countries. But a lot of the people who are moving across borders are forced migration because there aren't jobs at home and they're driven abroad and then they're working in terrible conditions, and that actually robs their home countries of a huge amount of talent and expertise. And you have that problem now in Italy, Poland, parts of Eastern Europe, where all the young people are going west to get better paid jobs, and they have a real dearth of people becoming doctors and so on in their own home countries. So I think it's actually very misleading to say that this process is of benefit to all of the people concerned. I think it drives down standards everywhere.
Thank you very much. Do we have any more questions?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Standards of living are rising.
I would dispute that they're rising. I think that the statistics would show that they're not.
I would just respond. I think that's a really, really good point actually on the nature of World War I and World War II. What I would respond to that though was what was the solution, not just in World War II after, because we know World War I solution didn't really work. That was all about trying to deny Germany certain rights, change up. Essentially, it was shifting the deck chairs on the Titanic, right? It didn't work. But what was the response to World War II? Well, it was a common market. It was pooling economic resources and ties between countries closer together. Now, this isn't a Remain or Leave speech. This is just trying to say what happened was we tied our economies closer together. And that essentially meant greater cooperation, greater ties between nations. And also then I think it's important to not just limit our analysis of this to World War II in Europe. Look at what happened to Japan. Japan was largely forced to accept a constitution that brought trade tariffs, tried to internationalize its trade, build links with America. And Japan is now one of the most successful countries in the world. And undoubtedly, the solution here to international conflict was more globalization. I think you can totally right in saying that globalization, in some people's minds, is not necessarily a healthy idea. But the idea that globalization, as it has happened now, has done more harm than good, is not, I think that's flawed.
Yeah, just to continue that point, so to say that because there was a view of a globalised world order that was a totally warped view, led to or contributed to the ideology which led to the Second World War. I think that's just a non sequitur. It doesn't follow that all forms of globalisation are wrong just because Nazism is wrong. Just as all forms of
have that plan to institute free markets. It wasn't decided after the war, oh, let's all get along now. It was planned from the start.
But you said the First World War and the Second World War arose as a result of global ideology. Just because a global ideology of Nazism was wrong, it doesn't follow from that the globalisation of the 1980s to the current day is also wrong. On the point on sweatshops and so on, it's really important to get our counterfactuals right here and to, I think, follow the logic of this through, because we are debating a motion. Globalisation has done more harm than good. And the right counterfactual is not, obviously, to compare the people in sweatshops in Bangladesh with the garment workers as they would have been here when the multi-fibre arrangement and all the rest of it existed in the 1980s and 1990s. But as you say, with their alternative forms of employment before those industries developed. And there is no question that those alternative forms of employment involved far worse working conditions, much riskier situations, and a huge proportion of the people of South Asia and East Asia before 1980, probably about half, lived on the edge of starvation. As I put it in my initial talk, one bad harvest away from malnutrition. And that has changed, and it's changed radically, and I don't think we can deny that it's changed. And I think that outweighs, even if you believe that globalisation has done more harm in the West than good, which I think is an incredible proposition, but even if you believe that, I think what it has done for poorer people in South Asia, East Asia and those other parts of the world which have participated in the process of globalisation outweighs that many times.
You say you had a short response? Okay. You have the last two questions. Yes, yeah.
Vincent, Collingwood. So there was lots of talk about Asia and Europe's role in globalization, and I'd like to hear what you think about how regions like the Middle East or Africa have been influenced by globalization, because there was lots of success in Asia where people got more jobs and got wealthier, but then in the Middle East there have been lots of political destabilizations due to international oil interests. In Africa, for example, farmers cannot compete with international industrialized means of production, and for example, Nestle as an international company is buying up water resources there. So I'd like to hear your position on really important stuff.
We have one final question. Yes, yeah, in the back.
Just on the subject of, just raised at the end there, the subject of the idea of, Indian, South Asian and, the Chinese economies transitioning from a situation where it's run by harvest and starvation to Olympic sport. So surely that's not about globalisation, surely that's just a transfer from the previous globalisation of, colonial ownership of these states and colonial influence over China to reorganising the economy so that they more focused on supplying for their own populations and also adopting more advanced, say European Western technologies. Just because, say, East Anglian farmers adopt Dutch methods of irrigation and flood management doesn't mean that East Anglian farmers have to be hot to Dutch bankers and Dutch economists in the same way, the average Chinaman or the average Indian when he's farming, just because he adopts a Western style of farming doesn't mean that he has to then write off his country as the being hot as a puppet, an economic puppet of the Western world.
So you must really keep your responses to questions as really possible.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. I think the idea that 1 billion Indian people are in hock to the Western world is just incorrect. What happened in India is that for 30 years there was a highly protectionist country, the licensed Raj as it was known. And then in the 1990s, they opened to the world. Again, not to the same extent as New Zealand or Australia or whatever, but to a much greater extent than before. And as a result of that, and other things as well, poverty has reduced. And it's not just technology. But having said that, the transfer of technology from the West to these countries is an aspect of globalisation, just as the transfer of technology in farming from Holland to England was an aspect of an earlier era of globalisation, and we're all able to benefit from that. In relation to Africa, a friend of mine who a few years ago did a BBC programme called The Devil's Footpath from Cairo to Cape Town, going all the way across Africa. 4 times she had to fly to an adjacent country via London because she couldn't fly from one country to the next. That's one indicator amongst many of how protectionist and isolationist many African countries are. They've certainly changed in the last 10 or 15 years, but it's been a much more recent change than the changes that have happened in Asia. And I think it's certainly interesting that the most protectionist continent in the world is without question where most poverty still lies.
Do you have a short response? Yeah.
So that's a good question. Why has so much of the world been left behind of this reduction in poverty? Again, we're not giving the Chinese, and I hate to quote the communist Chinese government, but we're not giving them enough credit. The reason they took so many people out of poverty is because they were smart. It's not because they were globalist, it's because they were protectionist. They maintained high trade tariffs, they favoured their own industries, they poured investment into them, and they even manipulated their own currency to win trade wars. The African countries didn't do that, the Chinese government did. The Chinese lifted nearly 1 billion people out of poverty. It's not globalization, it's protectionism, it's an effective, I hate to say, state-run economy.
Thank you very much. We will now move on to summation speeches. So first of all, we have a summation case for the opposition, which will be Ian Stewart. Over to the summation speech.
you, Madam President, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for what has been a fascinating debate and has opened up many different lines of questioning and thoughts. The first point I'd like to make in summing up is it's not a binary choice. Is globalisation good or bad? No one's saying it's all been good. And it's not all been bad. What's a balance? And I will contend that that balance is a positive one. That we are, and by we I mean the globe, in a better place because of it than without it. And as I said in my opening remark, and others have mentioned, we are healthier, better educated, living longer, understanding each other much more because of globalisation. One of the proponents talked about people and markets as if they were different things. The market is the people. And when there are difficulties, be it child labour, poverty wages, poor environmental practice, because consumers are better educated, the global media will pick up on bad practice and have it going round the globe almost instantly. Consumers become better educated, and those companies that persist in those bad practices will lose out. So I would contend that globalisation of information and education and connection and understanding over time will raise up all standards. It's not going to happen overnight. The world is imperfect. There'll be people who try and cheat the system, false information, all sorts of things. Of course there will be. But that doesn't mean that the direction of travel is in the wrong direction. Pick up on a couple of other points. There's the security point. Does globalisation mean increased terrorism? Well, I did some research for a work, an article I wrote a few years ago about, and this was at the height of Al-Qaeda and the threat of Islamic terrorism. And yes, some of those acts of terrorism are very visible, mass casualties, of course. But the number of terrorist incidents at that time was actually substantially less than it had been in the 1970s. When the IRA was at its height, Bader Meinhof, and all the other terrorist groups that were operating at that time, there were more terrorist incidents. So, although we've had globalisation in those few decades since, it hasn't led to an increase in terrorism. Another point was made about Africa and protectionism and big multinationals exploiting it. Well, let me just put this point to you. One of the reasons I supported us leaving the EU was because I regarded the EU as quite a protectionist bloc. And yes, it wanted to import from Africa raw materials, but not processed goods. We'll buy the coffee from you, but we'll have the rich production and product development here in Europe. Globalisation means that African countries can develop and have a more functioning economy and all the benefits that produces by being allowed to develop that sector themselves. So, ladies and gentlemen, I urge you to reject the motion. Whether it's economically, scientifically, culturally, individually, the more we connect with each other, the better we will be. Remember Ian Forster, only connect the poetry and the prose, and both are enriched. Thank you very much.
Speech, and I would like Alan Corrie to close the case for the proposition and the debate as a whole.
So one of the frustrations with the debate about globalization is that it's one of those words that causes intense debate just on the meaning of the word. What is globalization? We've heard from the opposition that globalization means scientific and medical cooperation. Does it? There was even scientific cooperation in the Cold War between the United States and the USSR. Was that globalism? We've heard that globalization means diversity and an enriching of cultures. Does it? Last I looked, cultures spring from local identities, national identities, and globalization is not, to put it mildly, a fan of national identities. It's a fan of eroding them. Globalization would like, everyone to wear the same suit, work in the same job, work in the same skyscraper. And then there's the economic argument, which I think is the crux of the matter in globalization. And we've already gone over this argument about the reduction in poverty. I've said that the opposition has said that this reduction has happened because of globalization. I've pointed out, and I'll point out again, that China and India are protectionist countries and they never stopped being protectionist. What globalization is most concerned about, I think, is reducing the costs of labor and enriching Western multinational corporations. Because when you outsource jobs from industrial heartlands in the US and the UK, the wages will go, the jobs will go, but corporate profits and the GDP will go up. And that's ultimately what's at stake for globalization. It's not really about diversity. You don't need globalization to have, I believe the point was made about more interesting food. I mean, we have the recipes, we don't need globalization. The sweatshops. Some have said that people working in the sweatshops lived a better life than they previously did. That may be the case, but again, where did that happen? It happened in protectionist countries. It happened in India and China, Southeast Asia and Asia. Can't be put down for triumph in globalization. So, if I had to sum up the impact of globalization, it has been very, very good for the global 1% who have benefited from rock-bottom labor prices, who have benefited from cheap goods coming out of Asia and Southeast Asia, and it's been appalling for ordinary people here in the West. I don't dispute that people in China and India have seen massive advances in their standard of living, but I wouldn't put that down to globalization. So if you support lower wages for everyone, if you support massive increase in property prices in London, if you think that China and India are globalist success stories rather than protectionist success stories, then support the opposition. But other than that, I would urge you to vote aye.